We can talk about the gender pay gap. Of course, it exists. And if we're not able to have a conversation about why it exists, we're not going to be able to address it.
When women succeed and when women are making more money, it helps the whole economy.
I'm Rachel Cottam, and this is the Allies at Work podcast. Here, you'll discover bite-sized tactics that you can start using today to improve gender equity in your workplace, home, and community. In today's episode, I'm going to break down everything I know about the gender pay gap. I live in the U.S. state that ranks worst for gender equality, and that includes compensation. Where most of the U.S. hovers around a 16-cent pay difference between men and women, Utah's pay gap is closer to 28 cents. Yikes. So today, I'll answer two important questions. First, is the gender pay gap a myth? And second, should we address it? Let me preface this by saying I am not an economist. I am a marketing leader, professional writer, and community advocate who leads a committee to close the gender pay gap in our state. I've made it my mission to learn and hear from as many different perspectives on this issue as possible, and it's my goal today to present my findings as objectively as I can. That said, I may get something wrong, and when I do, I hope you'll reach out to me and help me learn more. There's a contact page on my website, and I'll be waiting for your email. It's just like we say here, learn more, do better. And of course, at the end of each episode, I share an allyship microaction with you. Today's allyship action, have a salary conversation. Should be fun. In her 15th year of teaching, my great-grandma made $1,700. That year, a male teacher started at her school with a salary of $2,000. It was his first year of teaching. He had no prior experience, and, as was accounted for in compensation at the time, he had no spouse or children. My Gigi, who had 15 years experience at a house full of kids, was furious. According to my paternal grandma, Gigi petitioned the principal and went so far as to take it to the school board. She asked, why was this male teacher making so much more than her? You have a husband, they said. He needs the income to provide for a future family, they said. You're a woman, they did not say. Despite all her efforts, the school board never adjusted her salary to equal or exceed that of her male peers. Gigi never really got over this. When my grandma told me Gigi's story, she mentioned under her breath that she thinks this conflict is part of the reason Gigi started on the pills. When I asked my grandma what she meant by the pills, she brushed it off with a comment about Gigi's blues and a look that said we would not be discussing this further. My Gigi was snubbed in the 1950s, but even in 2024, women still only make 84 cents on the dollar in the US. This is why we're talking about the gender pay gap, because for Gigi's sake, we can do better. So, is the gender pay gap a myth? In a recent survey to my LinkedIn audience, 5% of folks believed that the pay gap is a myth. This data was reinforced by a survey completed by the Utah Women in Leadership Project last fall. According to the research, 15% of Utahns disagree at some level that the pay gap exists at all. Many of the folks in my network who have said that the pay gap is a myth work in finance or quant roles. This was curious to me. What about the economics of the pay gap makes it so hard to believe? I reached out to Heather Cameron, a data director who has worked at PayScale and Syndio, two tech companies who research compensation gaps and create work equity software to solve it. Heather also holds a master's in applied mathematics from Johns Hopkins. Here's what I learned from Heather. You may know some of this already, but it's a good reminder for folks who are trying to understand if we should and how we can address the pay gap. First, let's answer our question. Is the gender pay gap a myth? No, but it is commonly misunderstood. The gender pay gap can be measured in two ways, adjusted and unadjusted, or controlled and uncontrolled. We name the metric such because of the way the data is adjusted based on certain factors. The unadjusted gender pay gap is around 84 cents on the dollar in the United States. This number accounts for all men and women and does not adjust for factors like title, industry, or education. The unadjusted pay gap of 84 cents is the number that you've likely heard before. It's all over social media on Equal Pay Day in March, and in some states like the one I live in, that gap is much larger, closer to 72 cents on the dollar. The adjusted gender pay gap, on the other hand, is quite small, at 99 cents on the dollar. This number is adjusted or controlled in order to do a more accurate apples-to-apples comparison. Rather than looking at all the fruit in the barrel, this number compares men and women at the same title, in the same industry, and with the same education or experience. Nationally, the adjusted gender pay gap is 99 cents, but again, this gap is larger in states like Utah. This 1 cent difference means that in the majority of cases in the US, men and women who do the same job are paid the same because, guess what? It's illegal to do otherwise. According to the Equal Pay Act of 1963, men and women in the same role in industry must be given equal pay for equal work. Compensation discrimination could mean big trouble for your business. However, even in the adjusted pay gap, a 1 cent difference remains. This is statistically significant. It is not a 0 cent difference, and that gap can compound over time. According to a recent report by the Center for American Progress, the gender wage gap can add up to $1.6 million in lost retirement savings for women. Either way you measure it, the gender pay gap does exist. To convince naysayers that the pay gap is real, we need to distinguish between unadjusted and adjusted data. So, what factors do impact the pay gap? According to the U.S. Department of Labor, about 32% of the unadjusted pay gap can be explained by differences in education, industry, and competition. Women tend to work in lower paying industries, including those more commonly associated with caregiving attributes like teaching and nursing. About 65% of jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year will be filled by women. In jobs that pay $100,000 or higher annually, women only make up about 33% of employees. The industries women work in can sometimes be explained by choice, but why do women make the choices they do? For example, why would a woman believe she should become a teacher rather than a tech founder? Well, we know socialization has had a hand in these choices, and socialization is hard to measure. We also know that women are less likely to be promoted into high-paying roles that would help narrow the gap. McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report reveals how the greatest obstacle women face on the path to senior leadership and the pay that comes with it is the broken rung. Picture the ladder that women must climb to the C-suite. Women climb the first rung, securing an entry-level job, with about equal success as men. But for every 100 men promoted and hired to manager, only 72 women are hired or promoted. Anyone who has made the leap from an individual contributor role to a manager role knows how hard it can be to secure that first management position. I remember what it was like, trying to convince my boss that I could lead and manage a team, even though I hadn't done that prior. Your boss or hiring manager inevitably asks, "Have you managed people before?" Well, no, you say, but I'm leading my company's women's ERG, I manage contractors, and I'm the full-scale project manager for our team. I'm compassionate, and I'm a critical culture builder as well. We're sorry. We're really looking for someone who has managed people before. How are you ever supposed to get that first management job if all management jobs require management experience? In The Authority Gap by Marianne Seigert, she explains how men are often evaluated on their potential, while women are evaluated on their performance. Men get promoted to manager level roles because we see greatness in them, but women only get promoted to manager roles if they've proven themselves first. Take a look at the C-suite and you'll see just how big an impact this broken rung can have. In McKinsey's report, they found 48% female representation in entry-level roles, about an even split between men and women. Once you move up to senior VP or C-suite positions, only 28% were women. When we go back to the data from the U.S. Department of Labor, we find that a lingering 68% of the disparity in women and men's pay cannot be explained by measurable differences. This is most obvious when comparing the adjusted pay gap within a single occupation. Consider the role of Chief Executive Officer, where women with the same title and responsibilities as their male counterparts make 72 cents on the dollar. Women truck drivers make 77 cents on the dollar. Female lawyers make 87 cents on the dollar, and the list goes on. In addition, the adjusted pay gap is wider for women of color, women with children, and women over 35. For Latina and Native American women, the gap is over 45 cents. The effects of the broken rung also hold back women of color the most. For every 100 men promoted to manager, we see only 54 Black women hired and promoted. One other important factor in creating the gender pay gap is the motherhood penalty. This data shows that women who have children receive a 6% decrease in compensation over time compared to their childless peers. Men who have children, on the other hand, receive a 6% compensation increase, what's called the fatherhood bonus. As we look at the gender pay gap, it's important to pair it with this data around the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood bonus to help us understand how we can close that gap. Maybe the pay gap doesn't represent what you thought, maybe it does. But based on what we can measure and what we can't, the largest agreed upon factor in impacting the gender pay gap is this: women's labor is still undervalued by society. So, on to question number 2. Should we address the gender pay gap? If so, how? Before I answer this question, I want you to hear from a few voices on the Utah Gender Pay Gap Committee. Each of us has our own why for addressing the gap. Consider these perspectives from a few men, women of color, mothers, non-binary folk, and other amazing humans.
I care about the pay gap because everybody needs to know that their contribution is valued, and it's hard to be in situations where you know that you're being paid less than the person who's sitting across the table from you. Pay should be based on performance and on merit as opposed to what somebody else thinks.
I care about the gender pay gap because we need both men and women equally in spaces, and we get all the perspectives, and that can't happen if we don't have equity. Originally, got my degree, was a stay-at-home mom, and then I needed to earn money to support my family. And so I worked for 15 years. And then I divorced about a year and a half ago, and now I'm working full time. And so the story is, I'm sure, familiar to a lot of different people. And I'm so grateful that I had the 15 years because as much as at the time I didn't want to be doing it, I'm so grateful for you because it really paved the way for me to be able to better support my family and to be in a more professional path.
We can talk about the gender pay gap. Of course, it exists, but we have to talk about why it is. And if we're not able to have a conversation about why it exists, we're not going to be able to address it. I have daughters, and I'm raising my 3 kids in a multicultural home. And so inclusion and diversity are also very important to me. I want to help us move the conversation forward so that everyone is able to make more informed and better choices. Of course, that's for every individual woman to decide.
The disconnect is that women, especially African-American women, are not paid their worth in regards to the work that they do, in regards to what they offer. There is a lot of conversation in our communities about like how we can support and how we can be active, yet the miss is that we're not paying these individuals for the work that they can do and the expertise that they do offer.
I am the daughter of a single mother who raised 3 girls, and I'm the aunt of 2 beautiful young ladies. And I want them to know that they deserve everything that male counterparts have.
Utah should take action on the pay gap because it allows for our businesses to thrive and grow.
My friend had a shirt that I think speaks from this. It said, "Pay me like a white man." And I agree. Let's get women to be paid equal.
So let's think about cancer. I can explain why cancer happens a lot, right? Sun, environmental stuff, but it still exists. We all know, we've all been touched by that in some way. Cancer still exists even though I know what causes it. And we analogize that to the wage gap. Well, just because I can explain the wage gap by educational differences, by industry differences, by job title differences, doesn't make it go away. It still exists. I just understand what causes it more, so I can develop ways to help mitigate it. I understand that sun causes cancer, so I can put on sunscreen and help mitigate it. It's the same with the wage gap. Once I understand and I go through that process of adjusting the wage gap, I can then create solutions.
When I moved to Utah several years ago, I was really surprised on what wages look like. And then as I got into the workforce, I realized there were some challenges. So it really actually pushed me to start my own business. So I didn't have to face those things. I want to see families be able to maximize their earning potential. And that includes women and includes men. And when women succeed and when women are making more money, it helps the whole economy, especially children.
As you heard from many of these folks, the gender pay gap is personal. This is why they so firmly believe that we need to take action as individuals, governments, and societies. But not everyone agrees that addressing the pay gap is the right thing to do. Politicians and economists who argue against addressing the gender pay gap often cite the notion that policy is just too blunt a tool. These folks believe that the market is already doing a good job closing the gap, and that the market is actually better suited to supporting women's financial goals. Opponents of addressing the pay gap believe that individuals and families should feel free to choose work arrangements based on their life circumstances. And they believe that the ability to make these choices is becoming easier as benefits like flexible work and maternity leave become less costly to employers. Importantly, these politicians and economists who argue against addressing the gap are not arguing that the wage gap is a myth. After all, the world saw Claudia Goldin win a Nobel Prize in economics for her research on the wage gap in October 2023. I'll spend the rest of my time sharing arguments for addressing the wage gap and a few suggestions that you can implement in your workplace, whether you're an executive or an individual contributor. I'll leave it to you to determine whether policy is needed in your state or local government. What I will say is that when we empower women financially, we empower families and futures. In other words, when we get women out of boxes, we get men out of boxes too. Katie Ward, Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer of the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario, disagreed with the argument that women and families are free to choose work arrangements that work for them. I grew up in a culture that revered stay-at-home motherhood, so much that it took me years to decide to fully invest in my career because in some ways I thought I was going against religious truth. But Katie explains that when we continue to play this narrative that women just want to be mothers or just want to be present with the children, and that's why the wage gap exists, we're actually missing out on half of the population. Katie says motherhood is a noble, beautiful, high calling, but so is fatherhood. And part of the conversation around the wage gap is enabling men to be present too. As long as we continue to put the caregiving burden on women, saying that it's innate to us and our biology, we're actually denying men the opportunity to lean into their biology and their innate compassion as fathers. When men are given the choice, they also want to be active in parenthood, especially when corporate structure and policy systems enable them to do so, and also when the social stigma doesn't make that an uncomfortable choice for them. As we've discussed many times on this podcast, if we expect to see change in gender equity and expectations at work, we need men to parent out loud, to take their parental leave, to advocate for closing the wage gap. We can't ask women and other underestimated and unprotected groups to assume the risk of speaking up against the wage gap in their organizations if men aren't showing up as parents and allies. So yes, men, we need your help. Here are 4 things you can do. First, conduct a pay audit to see where inequities exist in your organization by race or gender. If you're not in HR or the C-suite, you can request that an audit be completed by the company. Advocate for a pay audit regularly to make sure that your request is not being ignored. If you're a people manager and your company refuses, as was once the case for me, conduct an audit for your own team. I sat down and created an Excel spreadsheet pulling in the salaries of each of my team members to make sure that they were being paid equitably across gender and race. You should already have access to salary and demographic data. Pull this into a spreadsheet and do some quick math. Then, when discrepancies exist, make the case with your executive team to correct these inequities. Be sure to back up your recommendations with business results like time saved or money earned. Second, implement family-friendly policies that support women in more competitive industries, including policies like parental leave and flexible work. I've been lucky enough to work in tech for the last 7 years, where competitive benefits is the name of the game. I feel like every startup I've worked for has tried to one-up its neighbor with cooler swag, better insurance, or longer parental leave. Unfortunately, parental leave only serves to close the gap if both men and women take advantage of it. While any mom understands how critical maternity leave is to her physical recovery and bonding time, there is a disadvantage of being out of the workforce for that time period. Dads know this too. Remember the motherhood penalty? And dads often refuse their parental leave for fear of judgment or job security. When I surveyed my network, only 35% of dads took their full leave. If we truly believe in gender equity and closing the pay gap, we will offer parental leave to all parents and incentivize them to take it. Let's talk about flexible work. I've got a whole episode later on this season devoted to flexible work, but I'll say a few quick words about how I've seen it impact the pay gap specifically. It used to be expensive to offer flexibility to working moms or caregivers to elderly parents. But the pandemic made it a lot easier and a lot cheaper to offer flexible and hybrid work environments that benefit employees, and often women. More flexible job arrangements bring more women and mothers into the workforce, which leads to more diverse companies. And diversity breeds bottom line growth. McKinsey research shows that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to have financial returns above the national industry median. However, we're seeing companies move backwards in time by forcing teams back into in-office requirements. These old-fashioned expectations inhibit your ability to hire and support diverse talent. This hurts your bottom line. If you are in an industry that allows for flexible work, especially a high-paying industry that women have historically been barred from entering, please think twice about return to office requirements. The third thing you can do to help narrow the wage gap: actively push for childcare solutions for every family and support these with corporate policies. A report just came out from Boston Consulting Group and Moms First that found that companies that invest in childcare benefits see a positive ROI of 425%. This is one employee benefit that pays for itself. These childcare benefits might include things like regular stipends paid to employees by the company to help with childcare costs. They might include on-site or near-site childcare, where employees are offered priority access or discounted tuition. These benefits might include access to backup care providers, secured seats at a local childcare location, or dependent care FSAs. As with any employee benefit, your company should test and measure the impact of implementing childcare support. But this can be a really powerful way to impact the gender pay gap and drive higher retention and results. The fourth thing you can do to impact the gender wage gap is to enact wage transparency policies in job postings and ban salary history requests in hiring. 85% of Gen Z job seekers will not apply to a job if the pay range isn't listed. I mean, I'm less likely to apply to a job if I don't see a range there. Setting a culture of compensation transparency from the first interaction with a prospective employee can make a huge difference in closing the pay gap. If your company doesn't typically list salary in the job posting, bring it up in your first hiring call with a candidate. Say, we have a budget of X to X dollars for this role. Based on your experience, where do you fall within that range? Make sure candidates understand that you will advocate for them and have regular salary conversations when they do report to you. Some companies have gone so far as to ban any kind of negotiation in hiring because they've found it unfairly advantages men. You can get creative about the ways you empower women and every member of your team with salary information. Oh, and don't ask for salary histories in hiring. What she made previously is not a factor in determining her value to your company. At the end of this episode, I'll share one more micro action for allies to use, but I do want to take a minute and talk about negotiation. My male sponsors helped me negotiate a 54% raise when I was out of pay parity with male counterparts. It was my first full-time tech job, so I didn't have a clue what a good salary range was, regardless of gender. I also had no idea what a typical annual raise was or where my salary would fit within the pay band. While I'm incredibly grateful to my male sponsors and the female head of HR for negotiating this increase for me, this conversation only happened because I brought it up. I mentioned to my new manager that my previous boss had told me we'd reevaluate my salary at the end of the year. Even though my reporting line had changed and I knew it would be awkward to bring up compensation so soon, I asked anyway. Because I did, my boss and another male sponsor went to HR, who did an audit and found that my salary was way below what the men in my department were making. I would not have received that 54% raise if I didn't have the courage to ask about my compensation. Unfortunately, there are a few myths about negotiation that are still harming women's careers and our earning potential. First, there is the myth that women don't ask for raises as often as men. In a study by Laura Cray, Berkeley Haas professor of business, she found that women are just as likely to ask for raises as men, but we are more likely to be turned down. One woman I spoke to told me that her leadership team has an old school mentality and is simply not willing to negotiate with women for higher pay. Because women are socialized to be demure and accommodating, any talk of advocating for a higher salary is viewed as unseemly or unfeminine. Sometimes, women even feel pressure to accept more responsibility or a title change without a raise. Again, feeling that if we refuse, we'll lose out on future opportunities. But Catherine Valentine, in a Harvard Business Review article, says that backlash is not inevitable. While biases exist, organizations can educate their managers to expect women to self-advocate and resist expectations that women should be modest about their ambitions. In the meantime, we can learn to negotiate better by speaking the language of business. Tessa White, the TikTok job doctor, says that asking for a raise just because you haven't gotten one for a while will always lead to a no. Instead, you need to set up your negotiation against business strategies and outcomes. Any data you can share around time saved, money earned, or money saved is a great place to start. Remember, in any negotiation setting, focus the narrative not on why you want more money, but on why the company benefits. So let's go back to our two original questions. First, is the gender pay gap a myth? And second, should we address it? We know that the gender pay gap exists, though it can be measured in two ways. If we want to dispel any myths around the pay gap, we need to be clear about how we are measuring and referencing the pay gap. Should we address it? I think the clear answer is yes, but I'll leave the how up to you. From government policies to corporate cultures to individual conversations, there are lots of ways to make an impact on the gender pay gap. Doing so benefits women, men, families, and everyone. At the end of each episode, I share an allyship micro action with you, something that you can start doing right away. Today's allyship action: have a salary conversation. I've made it a habit to proactively share my compensation with female friends or women who come to me for career advice. This way, they don't have to ask the awkward question. It's a simple act, but if we can make this information more readily available to women, and especially women of color, it's easier for them to know when they're being underpaid and what their target range should be. I know this can feel awkward and scary. There's still a stigma around talking about money. But your right to communicate with other employees about your compensation is actually protected under the National Labor and Relations Act. If you're working in the private sector and your employer tries to say that you can't talk about this, that's actually illegal. I've also held workshops where I've prompted everyone in the audience to share their salary with a neighbor. When I've asked attendees how it felt sharing their salary, they said awkward, weird, embarrassing, intense. But they also said it felt really empowering. Because even today, talking salary is taboo for many of us. Especially as women, we feel we're breaking the rules by having transparent salary conversations. Well, guess what? That very feeling is the reason we need to keep having these conversations. If we want to eliminate the pay gap for mothers and women of color, we need to empower each other with knowledge. But what if you share your salary with her and she's making less than you are? What if she has more years of experience and she thinks you're a fraud? Then, no matter what the number is, we won't hold anything personally against you. It's the system of inequity that we have a problem with, not you. You should be paid well, but we also need data to inform our salary conversations and career goals. It can be hard to know where to start, so here are 3 options to make the salary conversations easier. First, when salary questions come up in the workplace, extend a general invitation to your network. Say, I'm happy to share my salary one-on-one. Just let me know if you're interested. Second, if you're uncomfortable sharing your current salary, share a recent salary instead. Say, when I started in this role in this year, I made this much. A note here, if a female peer asks you for your current salary, it's not because she's trying to out-earn you. She's probably just trying to understand what she's worth. In these instances, it can be really meaningful to actually share your current salary instead of a previous. This gives her an accurate target to work towards with your mutual manager. Third, if you don't want to share an exact number, research the salary range for your title and share where you land within that range. Say something like, based on Glassdoor's current range for my title, I fall in the top of that range. Compensation shouldn't be shrouded in mystery. Let's keep feeling awkward and keep speaking up. Next time.
Society will condemn the struggling mother and praise the striving father.
They did the best that they could, but it could have been better if they had heard more voices.
Learn more, do better.